pleasure to welcome Eryk Salvaggio. Okay. Thank you. Great. A couple of words to give you guys some context. Eryk, as he describes himself, is a blend of an artist, hacker, and policy researcher. His multifaceted work spans technology, art, and critical inquiry, and addresses the relationships between systems, power, and technology, particularly in generative AI. Among many other things, Eryk is currently a visiting professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology and a researcher at metaLAB at Harvard. He's a Gates Scholar and is pursuing a PhD in digital humanities at the University of Cambridge. And probably you will know him as the face behind the influential blog and newsletter Cybernetic Forests, or his writing for Tech Policy Press. In his talk, Feel the Noise, Notes from an Adversarial AI Artist, Eryk proposes an adversarial, defined Gegenspieler, rather than collaborative position towards AI as a strategy to confront and regurgitate our notion of what AI is and does. Through his critical lens, he invites us to reconsider what it means to be a human in a world increasingly shaped by opaque algorithms, efficiency, and productivity. Please welcome again, Eryk.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for coming back for this talk. So when I got the invitation to be here, I had a question on my mind, which is, what exactly do I say to designers? And part of answering that question is, what exactly is design? And there's so many different ways of answering that question, but the one that I would sort of settle on for this talk is the idea that design is about, in some senses, the organization of information. And so this leads to this question, which is, what to a designer is artificial intelligence? And if design is the organization of information, if it's about whether you're designing a poster for a missing cat or a multi-billion-dollar city from scratch in the middle of an ocean, the question is about organization. The organization of information is what makes things legible. We create a kind of ontology. We create a way of making sense of the things that we are organizing. And if we think about that as one of the sort of strategic or fundamental definitions of design, then this question, what to a designer is AI, becomes, I think, quite complex. And for me, there's something about AI and what I would call a kind of regime of auto-completion that takes away some of our agency about the organization of things. And I think handing away that organization, handing away agency over how we shape, describe, what metaphors we use, there's a risk to that. And so in my work, I think a lot about design and interfaces, not necessarily as ways of building them, like the last speaker presented, but as ways of challenging them, getting under their skin and unsettling the assumptions about what the user is and wants that are so often baked into this simplification, which is an understandable desire on behalf of design, but isn't always necessarily the thing that we need in every circumstance. A while ago, I wrote a piece for Tech Policy Press addressing what I called the myths of generative AI. And the definition of myths that I provided basically fits into this idea that companies are marketing technology products and services, and they wield enormous influence over our understanding of things. This is done through marketing, which can lean into complexity, the black box, right? It's the algorithms or things we can't understand, and that can obscure the challenging aspects of those products. They can smooth out any rough edges through oversimplification as well. And the designers of marketing materials play a key role in that process. But so too do the designers of the interfaces. The interfaces purvey a certain kind of myth. They tell us a certain kind of story about the thing that we are interacting with. When we are invited to engage with an AI model through a prompt that is consistently telling us to imagine or dream, or asking us, what is it that you want to do? putting us in the position of requesting information, requesting services from the AI model, which is sort of positioned as this floating sort of superintelligence or emerging superintelligence. And there's good reason for that. We want simple metaphors in design. We don't want overcomplicated things, right? And yet, at the same time, this mythology is important to recognize as a mythology and to see that these myths animate the ways that designers imagine these systems, both in the space of designing the interfaces, but also as users. And as a result of this, and as a result of this way of thinking about designing the interface, I would argue that our frames for AI have become all kinds of wrong. A great example of this is the myth that LLMs, if you ever use ChatGPT, you'll notice it generates a few words at a time. There's a blinking cursor, it pauses, then it generates a few more words. And it seems like, oh, it's considering what to say next, right? It's evaluating its responses, or it's responding the way a friend would to your text message, typing a little bit, and then you have the 3 bubbles. But that's not actually what's happening. What's actually happening is that it's kind of able to spit out a giant sort of block of text. It's just that, as Sam Altman has recognized, and this is a stroke of design genius, I think, is that it looked more thoughtful when it paused. If it spits out a bunch of text, it doesn't look trustworthy. It looks like it's garbage. It looks like slop. But if it pauses and contemplates, it sends this message to the user that there's a real thinking thing happening behind there. There's a real process going on. And so this is a way of sort of operationalizing a myth of intelligence within these systems that obscure what's actually happening, which is a complex regime of basically auto-completion and fine-tuned models that are offering sort of filters for that auto-completion, right? That kind of thing we're no longer really accessing. And I want to be clear, why would we be? From the perspective of a designer, it's not necessarily evil intent to make us see something as simple, but it does encode a certain set of priorities, assumptions, and myths. So, what to an AI is a designer? We come back to this question again. In my work in AI pedagogy, I often look towards experiments that have been done, research that's been done in the context of design and the ways that designers are using AI. And there's a couple of examples here, mostly from 2024. One of them finds that using an AI image generator during ideation leads to higher fixation on the initial example. Participants who used AI produced fewer ideas with less variety and lower originality compared to a baseline, narrowing designers' ability to explore the creative space between abstract ideas and potential solutions. And we can imagine this as well. If I give you a list of things that you should be focusing on, you're going to focus on those things as a design brief. If you're going to Midjourney and you're asking for ideas of visualizing a certain type of outcome, you're going to see these ideas and you're going to work with those ideas. That's essentially what's been pointed out here. But this fixation on the output reflects a fixation on the brief. The task is framed as a problem to solve. Designers are using ChatGPT or they're using Midjourney to sort of come to solutions, and then maybe they explore from that solution, but it's limited, it's confined. And I think that this idea of the relationship, we often talk about AI as unlocking infinite potentials, infinite possibilities, infinite images. And we don't often talk enough about how it's constraining what we might do otherwise. If we didn't go to Midjourney, if we didn't ask ChatGPT, there are opportunity costs involved in asking the models to solve our problems. I'm getting a spam call from Tennessee. I'm on airplane mode and I'm still getting a spam call, so I don't know how that's happening. So another 2024 study of writers found that access to generative AI ideas could cause stories to be evaluated as more creative and better written and even more enjoyable, especially among less creative writers. However, generative AI-enabled stories were similar to each other, more similar to each other than stories written by humans alone. In other words, there was a convergence of the ideas. They may have been more creative than the individual sort of unskilled writer may have come up with, but they were creating very similar stories, which is not novelty, despite the claims to the contrary. So with all of this as a way of thinking about this, having the relationship between constraints and possibility reversed in AI discourse, I want to talk about my own artistic practice, which focuses on this, which is noise. I want to talk briefly about diffusion models and how they work. Basically, we can imagine if I asked you to look at the nighttime sky and find a specific constellation, you might have a constellation in your head and you might look up at these stars and you might say, okay, I can find that constellation. I can see that constellation in there because Eryk has told us it's there and we trust him. And so you might look up there and you might say, there it is. There's that constellation, the Big Dipper, we call it. I know you don't call it that here. But there it is. That must be it because he's told us that it's up there and I have an idea of what the pattern looks like. And I can match that to these bright lights in the sky. And essentially, if we change out the stars for pixels and we replace the constellations with whatever prompt you're using, on a really basic level, that's a way to understand how diffusion models work. But they're not looking at stars. They're looking at this. They're looking at clusters of randomly colored pixels as a starting point through which to find the image that you've described to it. If I tell you that the Big Dipper is in this, it's going to find it, but it's not actually there. And as it goes through the process of cleaning up this noise in search of whatever we've described in a prompt, there's another element to it, which is called clip, at least in most of these models today. There's alternatives, but they're all doing more or less the same thing. And what they are doing is comparing the words in your prompt to a certain kind of category space. So here we see some regions that are recognizable as associated with specific words. So if an image of noise is starting to take a certain type of shape, it can be compared to the patterns associated with the words that we see here for regions, for example. And so if I ask it for, just type the word USA in a prompt in a very basic manner, this image here of George Washington with a flag on his head is basically what it's looking at. That's the sort of central space that this noise has to be resolved toward, constrained toward. If we ask for Australia, and I learned this live on stage in Australia recently, it looks for something like this. And so if you ask for an Australian person, you get 3 koalas and 4 men and a woman, and some other signifiers, right? You get the flags and stuff like this as well. But this koala is basically telling us something about the model. It's telling us that it doesn't have an idea of what you're looking for, and maybe this is obvious. But what it's doing is constraining this noise and all the possibilities in that noise to a very central, structured idea of what this word Australia corresponds to in a data set of 5 billion images. Just to illustrate it more clearly, when we have this image of noise, the very first step that comes out of that noise is oftentimes this kind of blurry, smeary image. And from there, we could take this and we could direct it. We could say, okay, this needs to become a picture of a cat, or this needs to become a picture of a dog. And depending on which one we ask, it's going to apply a cat pattern to that blob of noise. That blob of noise is generated randomly every single time, so we're not going to see the cat the same way. But what we can also see is the similar structure between the cat and the dog and that blur, because that noise is being structured into the details of the cat or the dog. So we can see between the dog and the cat similar patterns in the fur coloration, but more clearly, we can see the paws. The paws are in similar positions, and they correspond to white spaces in the noise. Likewise, if you look at the reflection in the wooden floor or the horizon, you can see it corresponds to this kind of blue patch up at the top. That's resolved over the course of about 70 steps. And the way that this is built is carrying on a long historical trajectory of how we've envisioned and talked about and imagined artificial intelligence. Marvin Minsky was working with computer vision back at MIT, late 70s, I think, early 80s, this might have been. And he comes up with this idea of the frame system theory, and he borrows it from psychology. He basically says, when one encounters a new situation or makes a substantial change to one's view of a problem, one selects from memory a structure called a frame. This is a remembered framework to be adapted to fit reality by changing details as necessary. A frame is a data structure for representing a stereotyped situation, like being in a certain kind of living room or going to a child's birthday party. Attached to each frame are several kinds of information. Some of this information is about how to use the frame. Some of this information is about what one can expect to happen next. And some is about what to do if these expectations are not confirmed. So this is Minsky's frame system theory. And he's talking here about something that in psychoanalysis, psychology, is called a schema. This idea that we kind of know what to anticipate when we go to a place called an art school. And we might have some image in our head of what an art school is going to be like. And we might have that image in our head until we get to the art school. And then we realize, actually, this is quite different. And there's something important about that change that we are able to do. We are able to adapt our schemas and evolve our schemas and adjust these schemas. And in many ways, a lot of the work that we have to do in a sort of social context is updating those schemas, getting out of those ideas of the stereotype, getting out of those ideas of how we expect someone to behave. And yet, that's not exactly what these models are capable of doing. And I think that's really important, because what the human can do is expand these schemas, can build upon and grow them to encompass all kinds of different experiences. Whereas what an AI image model is doing is trying to constrain noise, unstructured possibility, to fit pre-existing schemas in its own model and training. And so we ask, what about this? What about the noise? What is it that is being constrained? And what does this noise stand for? And there's a long sort of conversation about what noise is and the way we think about noise. Noise in systems does weird things. And the way we categorize noise and the way we categorize signal is very much about our own schemas and our own ways of viewing the world and what we expect. When something happens that we don't expect, it's noise. When something happens that we are looking for and matches our patterns, well, that's a signal. Noise also has parallels in psychoanalysis. It is the overwhelming freedom of choice, says Cecile Malaspina in a book called Epistemologies of Noise. And this overwhelming freedom of choice is constrained by schemas, which are a fundamental principle, as mentioned, of AI research. But schemas were never meant to be the limit of our experience. We are meant to negotiate, challenge, discard, and adapt them. And so noise images, to me, represent glimpses of still unmodeled possibilities. The thing where we don't know quite what to expect at the art school or the birthday party, and we acknowledge that we don't know what's going to happen. This unimaginable future, when there's things that we're going into that we haven't experienced before, is actually thrilling and exciting, and it's part of what's being human. But it's also sort of freeing, and freedom of that kind can also be quite terrifying. Sometimes if we don't know what to expect, we don't want to do it at all. And so I think we need to start thinking about what it is that we're losing when we engage with this idea of only thinking about images in terms of infinite possibility based on what we've already seen. And so noise to me comes to represent a confrontation between what is uncomputable or irreducible to this concept of schemas, to this concept of mathematical optimization. Recently, I had a conversation with ChatGPT. I'm very sorry that you have to listen to this conversation. It's a bit like describing dreams at this point. And I need to say as well that just because ChatGPT says something about itself doesn't mean it's true. It's still capable of hallucinating about itself as much as anything else. But I asked it recently to generate an image of Gaussian noise. That's that exact kind of random distribution of pixel colors that you just saw. And it's not able to do it. And no model that I've ever worked with has been able to generate an image of Gaussian noise. Video models can't do it. Sonic models based on diffusion cannot do it. ChatGPT cannot do it, as you see here. It's an error on its end, but I asked it more. Why can't you generate an image of Gaussian noise? And I think the response was fascinating. So I'm going to read from why the error happened. My image generation system, which leans towards visually coherent artistic or photo-like results, isn't optimized for purely mathematical or abstract visual patterns like Gaussian noise. It tries to find meaning or form, and Gaussian noise, being random pixel intensity variations with a normal distribution, doesn't provide that kind of structure. When I prompted it to generate a Gaussian noise, the I, by the way, is ChatGPT, and the it is also ChatGPT, which I find interesting. When I prompted it to generate Gaussian noise, it probably choked, trying to reconcile that with its usual patterns of, quote, what an image should look like. Now, as an artist, that's what I want to hear. I want to hear that it can't do something beyond what it thinks an image is supposed to look like. But it raises a really interesting question, which is, what is an image supposed to look like? And according to ChatGPT, it's not supposed to look like this. Now, I'm showing you this as an artifact. This is an early experiment with prompting with Gaussian noise models. And going into Stable Diffusion, I was able to create this image. But one of the things I do in my role in research is I kind of learned how to go into the training data and see what are the terms and what are the photos associated with these terms. And there's nothing that looks like this in the training data for Stable Diffusion. There's nothing in the training data for noise specifically that would lead to this being the result. Here's another. And so what I have come to speculate is actually happening is that when you ask an image for an image of noise, it starts with noise, and so it's automatically finished. It's already done. That image recognition model that is supposed to compare your image of a cat, if you've asked for a cat, is the cat or is it noise? Well, it sees noise, and either way, it's right, because it's always noise that you're generating. But it's still got about 70 steps to process through, and what it usually does is it starts adding detail. Goes up the UNet structure if you're a techie. So it starts resolving detail as it goes on. So over the course of the steps, it starts adding more and more detail. It finds patterns and applies that to the noise. And the minute that it starts applying those patterns, well, it stops being recognizable as noise in the system, and so it gets noisy again, which sends it back, and then it's recognized as noise, and then it's cleaned up and clarified, and more pattern is added. And so what we are seeing here is a broken negotiation within the system between two things that it's not supposed to be doing because it's already done them. It's trying to resolve this in the direction of a pattern, but it's also trying to reduce this pattern into noise. But noise is what gets reduced in the first place. And so if this is hard to grasp, it's because it's essentially a paradox. It's a glitch. It's a glitch in the system. Here's another just random sort of output. Now, I think these are interesting. I don't necessarily think that they are in and of themselves something that I would call an artistic practice, but I find them as a material to work with fascinating. I find what they come to represent kind of fascinating. And I liken it to this material. This is a real image of Fordite. Fordite is a result of an industrial process. Ford Automotive was manufacturing cars, and they would paint them on an assembly line. And as they changed the colors, all of the paint would sort of drip into this pool underneath the painting surface back in the 50s and 60s. And so you accumulate these layers of paint with sort of the heaviest paint sort of sinking to the bottom and the lightest sort of floating on the surface. And so all of this material is just sort of thrown out. And for about 20 years, we were generating Fordite as a material, almost like a mineral, as a byproduct of an industrial process. And I think that the noise images, we might be able to think about them as a byproduct of a digital process. We're creating not automobiles, we're creating billions of images. And this, in a sense, is a kind of exhaust of that process. This is what happens when you ask Midjourney to do it, which I think starts to become more aesthetically interesting. This is from a model called Inference. It's created by Spawning, Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst project, trained on public domain images. So it's actually quite limited in what it can draw from. And this is what an image of noise comes to look like. And here's another. So as an artist, I'm really interested in a few things. I'm interested in challenging the sort of mythologies that are built into the interfaces of these generative AI systems. And so I want to be clear, yes, I know I could go into Comfy, I could go into all these other things, and I can filter the parameters. But what I'm really interested in is the kind of act of organization that is provided to the default user of a default corporate AI model. What kind of affordances are we dealing with here? What is it encouraging me to do? What is it discouraging me from doing? And so by being able to play with these systems through kind of adversarial lens, I think, and trying to get to something that goes beyond the intention of the designers or the expectation of how a user is going to behave. There's also something to me in a position, creating a kind of model for making distance from these tools, a way of saying, actually, you don't know me as well as you think, and actually, you can't do everything that you claim. So I wanted to show a few specific collections of work. This one, I think, is closely connected. It's about the origins of the diffusion model to begin with. The mathematics of diffusion come from fluid dynamics. And fluid dynamics, for a long time, this sort of idea of the sort of Brownian motion came out of this logic that, well, when pollen falls into a pond, it moves around. And the pollen, therefore, because it moves around, it's got to be alive. It's got to be thinking, right? It's got to be directing itself. It must be agentic. It must have some intelligence. It must be something akin to an insect. And so they go and they cook a bunch of pollen and they throw it back in the pond. And lo and behold, it is still moving around as if possessed with intelligence and intent. And so it's a couple of years later, they say, okay, well, pollen's dead, but we don't know what's going on here. And it's Einstein staring at a pond, realizing that there has to be something underneath the surface of the pond that is generating this activity. And he charts it out. He models it. He creates a model of the molecular movement of pollen on the surface of the water and comes to understand fluid dynamics. I'm simplifying the story, but what I find really interesting about this is that that discovery, the sort of mathematical model of fluid dynamics, has come to serve as the way we animate intelligence, the way that we make things look intelligent and creative. Because by acting out that pattern on these random images of noise, we make it look creative. But actually, it's just sort of resolving this sort of data in knowable ways, unexpected ways. And as a result, we think, oh, it must be making decisions. And so there's a link between this pollen appearing as lively and having this kind of vitality and this idea that artificial intelligence does. And by the way, we use this in all kinds of ways. We use it to move grass in video games. We use it to model cloud movement in video games and computer visualizations and things like this. We use it to mimic the natural world, but it's an illusion. So the pollen series is basically images of AI-generated glitches that I've collected through these experiments, paired with public domain images of what I call archival debris. It's books that have been scanned badly, it's book covers that are torn, it's photographs that have been degraded, and we mix them all up. This is through a residency of a kind of research invitation from Spawning, which is trained entirely on public domain images. So the idea is you build your own data set on top of their base model, and then you generate your own images. And so I created that base model, and then I asked it for images of pollen, which is what you see here, connecting to that idea of the illusion of intelligence and this sort of cycling of history, churning of history, and the churning of fluid dynamics in a diffusion model. I am very interested in archives, and I'm very interested in what these things are doing to shape the outcomes of these models. And this is a big part of my kind of research practice, is what's in the archives and how does it come through? And so SWIM is a piece that attempted in a way to visualize exactly how our experience of a training process is so severed, it's so invisible. What does it feel like to become training data is kind of the question that I was asking. And how do we relate to that? How do we see it? Part of this is a practice of what I call slow reading AI, thinking about these training processes that happen like this and actually slowing them down and contemplating what is actually happening there, not just in a technical level, but a kind of cultural level, a social level, and an emotional level. And so what we will see here, I'll play it, it's a short clip. The overall film is about 9 minutes long. It's Ninny Shipley, who's a swimmer from the 1930s, and there's archival footage. She's a dancer from the 1930s, and she's swimming, and it's a stag film. It's designed to be shown as a kind of erotic entertainment. These days it's very tame, so don't worry if if you're an American, I guess. So I've blended her image, I've slowed that image down, and then I've sort of trained. It's not an actual training process, but that degradation of the image, the slow removal of information that happens in a training process, we slowly strip out these pixels in order to understand how the noise moves through images. And what the model actually learns is how that noise is spreading through the images that we're training it on. And so what it actually does is identify the patterns of that spreading noise and then restore that. But it does that to a random image of noise. So it can't arrive at that original training moment, the training image. And I think about this, I introduce it gradually so we can sort of feel what it's like. I'll play it. And so what she's swimming up against is these glitches, essentially what the computer cannot resolve, right? The tension that a computer cannot resolve visually. And she's swimming in on top of that, and then in front of everything, it's all being dissolved into the sort of Gaussian distribution of noise. And I think that yes, it's about AI, but the responses that I've gotten to it are also that watching this film makes one contemplate just memory and the recall of memory and the loss of memory, which I think is an important piece of this. I think there's something about making this type of work that really connects to the bigger questions that make AI feel so unsettling to so many of us about replacement and memory and what is it changing about our world. Always with the slide decks after our video. So this is on display right now in exhibition I've curated called Signals to Noise, curated with Joel Stern and Emily Siddons down in Melbourne. The overall idea of the show is that artists have been working with communication technologies and against communication technologies since communication technologies have existed. And this idea that artists can be the source of noise in a channel and that noise can be the source of creativity, as opposed to the kind of engineering focus on telecommunication channels, which is you need to remove as much noise from the channel as you can. I think that artists are able to complicate this, and that friction between noise and signal is actually essential to any of these systems operating at all. And so by visualizing these frictions and playing with these frictions, I'm hoping to get at this idea, back to this idea of schemas and the resolution of things that are sort of feel unsettled and out of control. And this temptation that we have to say, well, how is this like something I've experienced before? How do we put this in a box and label it and say, that's the thing, we don't have to think about it anymore, as opposed to saying, this is noise, this is friction, and I'm not afraid of it. I'm okay to spend some time in this noise and do the work of finding the signal that I want to find in this place. I'm okay with all of this information and all of this possibility coming to me because that's how I find a way forward. And these two things are essential to one another. They're not a dichotomy, but we do need to learn a kind of fluidity between the two poles. So I'm kind of jumping around. I don't know what the chronology of these pieces is really. But I wanted to sort of talk about this idea of a critical AI practice. So how do I do that? How can we use this? And one of the things that I've been really excited about with AI, and the reason that I work with AI, is because I want to comment on it and I want to understand it. I don't want to be a commenter who doesn't know how it works. And I think it's okay to be that. I think you don't need to know the details of how it works if you want to understand social impacts and things like this. But for me, it's always been that I need to understand the technology if I'm going to talk about it. And the way that I understand the technology is through art making. And so I was having a conversation about all of the problems with AI, right? All of this sort of extraction that we talked about today, the operationalization of data, gathering practices without permission, the invisibility of labor. And I kind of had this moment where I didn't really want to even work with these tools at all. And I was having this conversation with HfG Schwäbisch, who's a researcher at Hugging Face, and it was about Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks is this woman, she's from the South in the US, 1948, no, sorry, 1955 maybe. She gets sick, she goes to a doctor. The doctor takes some of her cells, sends her home. She goes out dancing that night, but 2 weeks later, she dies. She had cancer, very rapid cancer, but the cells that they extracted from her, turns out, had a strange mutation, which is that they kept reproducing. Usually cells reproduce for a couple generations and then they peter out. But Henrietta Lacks's cells were infinitely regenerating, which meant that we could do all kinds of experiments on those cells. And those cell experiments led to all kinds of research breakthroughs, stem cell technology, cancer research, chemotherapy. All of these things came out of this. But her name was never acknowledged. Her cells themselves were actually mislabeled in the archive. And so they were spreading around to different labs. No knowledge to her family that any of these breakthroughs has come about as a result of Henrietta Lacks's body. And of course, Henrietta Lacks herself never knew of any of this. But if there's a parallel to this in the training data for AI systems, which is, we don't know where our data is going. We don't know how it's reemerging or how it's shaping the model's decisions. But we also don't have any images of Henrietta Lacks in the training data. We've got about 3. And so if you ask Midjourney to generate an image of Henrietta Lacks, you get this image of, which is heavily edited and changed here, but we get this image of a Black woman from 2024, basically, the year that it was made. And so we use this as a way of sort of narrating a video essay, and HfG narrates this video essay. We trained a model on HfG's voice, and we used that to generate the narration. And so by the end of it, what he reveals after telling the story of Henrietta Lacks is that the voice you've been listening to, which sounds very sort of North American, is actually being spoken by somebody who has a heavy Bengali Indian accent. And that by adding his data, his 60 seconds of data, to this chorus of North American training data, every aspect of his personal experience has been stripped out of his voice. And there's I think, a challenging relationship between these two ideas of the flattening of the individual and into a sort of collective and the corporatization of that flattening. All right. I want to talk about one more piece, and then we can get to questions. And I wanted to end on this piece because I think there's another interesting metaphor. A lot of the things that I'm trying to do with my work is think through different metaphors, different ways we can think about AI. And so I was working with a puppeteer, Emma Wiseman, and we got invited to do a residency at this place called the Mercury Store, which invites actors to come together with artists, and they work things out together. And so this was a puppet-focused residency. And one of the things we quickly learned is that if you ask any of these image models to generate an image of a puppet, it always adds strings. There's always strings in puppets. But Emma is a bunraku puppeteer. And bunraku is a practice where you have 3 people on the stage with the puppet, and you see them moving the puppet. And we really grasped onto this metaphor because we were thinking about bodies and labor. And this idea that a puppet with strings, the person controlling the puppet is out of the stage. You never see the person. The labor is obscured. And that's very much what's happening with AI, that we don't know where this information comes from. We don't know who's categorizing and labeling these training data sets. And so we wanted to ask, what exactly would it be to have a bunraku version of an AI model, or to make art that was a kind of bunraku version of the art? And so we started thinking about how image models, video models work. So I'll show you one of the first experiments. To the left, you have Emma is in the front, and they're basically working to try to create a video that moves their bodies in ways that the AI is likely to misunderstand. And then we start applying different filters. So the filters that are being applied, their bodies, that original video recording is becoming blurred. They're becoming noise in the model first. And then these additional layers are being added to it. And so we're thinking about it as touching the noise, being the puppet, being present with the puppet and moving, the puppet being the video model. And it's a reversal of this relationship where the puppet is us, right? That we're responding to the AI, and it's sort of telling us what to take and what to reject. So we started doing these shadow puppets, and this is something that has now become the basis of a workshop that we're kind of traveling around with, which is working with people to try to explain how these video models work, but to do it with their bodies and to get involved with it. And by casting shadows against this sort of coloration of lights, we start creating additional videos. And what we're asking the model to do here, this is just the original footage. What we're asking the model to do, well, this is now the generated video, is we're taking those shadows and we're asking it to create human arms, human hands, and puppets. And then we're laying that over so you can see the differences. So you can see that the shadow has actually become a real hand. And you can see that the real hand becomes this sort of empty, blurry space. And I think that there's something really lovely about this when we get into the still images. And what you're seeing here is essentially the back layer is the original film footage. In the middle is a layer of noise, and in the front is the layer that was generated by the AI model. And so in a way, there's a touching through the noise of the human bodies and their shadows and the AI generated images that result from the structure that those bodies are presenting. And so some of us were very familiar with AI. The actors who came in were not. And at the end, I think everybody sort of learned something about the relationship between AI. And so this is both a way of, I think, making interesting visual work, but it's also a way of creating a workshop where people become sort of literate in how AI works. Here's another image. Okay. Finally, I've been touring around Europe with a film called Human Movie. You don't need the sound. Human Movie has been, for the first time, it's a 30-minute long film that takes this idea of noise and signal and what it means to be human and how AI is complicating that. And it is a blend of archival footage, and it uses noise essentially as a visual language for unpacking and exploring these limitations between what a human can resolve intellectually and what a computer cannot resolve. And so I think that's it. But I want to end with this. Why do I call the practice adversarial? We often hear in creative AI conversations about collaboration with the model. And as a collaborator, I have to say AI is not a very good one. If AI was a person, I probably wouldn't work with it again. It's an unreliable source of information, and it closes off, I think, a power of our own imaginations if we just take it at face value. It's sort of someone saying, here's how to do it. And when I say, well, what if we did this or this? It's like, no, we're doing it this way. It gives you the finished product almost immediately, right? It's like somebody coming in and just being like, I wrote a song, like we're in a band together, I wrote the song, we're gonna do it this way. And that's not collaboration. I think that it also gives too much agency to AI, right? We're not collaborating with AI. We're trying to figure out what we can do with it based on the limitations of its affordances. We're basically being forced to sort of work within whatever a designer has decided that we're able to do or not able to do. And so with these commercial models in particular, I'm very reluctant about referring to them as collaborators. There are other models and there are other AI forms. I'm just going to say that before any of you raises your hand. But I'm speaking specifically here about commercial generative AI. And so for me, the adversarial relationship reframes this as a source of friction and creative and production friction. It challenges us to reject those affordances and to confirm and to verify anything that we are learning, and also to check in that the vision that we are seeing is the thing that we wanted to see, that it is answering our conceptual desires, the project's sort of goals. What do we want to see? As opposed to what did we get and whether do we like it or not. And those are two very different relationships to have with images and videos and music and writing. We want to arrive with confidence in our skills and our knowledge and our feelings that the things that we are conveying are the things we intended. And so for me, the best way to do that is to say to AI, I'm actually going to fight you. I'm going to wrestle you until this thing becomes the song that I want. So on that note, this is me if you want to find me, and I'm happy to answer questions. I also have zines from the Puppet Workshop which I guess no one else is selling anything or shilling anything, but I'm a working artist. I have to sell and shill. So if you're interested, please come talk to me. Thank you.
Okay, I think you know the game now. Questions. Come on, don't be schüchterlich. Okay, Leon.
Sorry, I always have a question. Anyways, yeah, beautiful work and works, multiple. Maybe first a very quick comment. Arguably, the noisy images you showed in the beginning, maybe they represent the algorithm and maybe the role of the algorithm represented in these images more, because we talk a lot about training data and what the data represents, but we never talk about the algorithm, and arguably the noise patterns you showed that are not in the training data, they kind of have to come from somewhere, and it's probably from the algorithm. So maybe it's a manifestation of the algorithm. But my question is not my question. I want to extend a question I got asked when doing similar images, which is kind of it's a sharp question, so don't take it personally. I took it personally when I was asked this question, but I didn't have an answer, so I'm hoping for you to have an answer.
I'm bracing myself.
So after presenting, maybe similar experiments, they didn't look as nice as yours, but in a similar direction, I was asked, isn't this AI glitch art? And if it is AI glitch art, then if we think about what's the legacy of glitch art beyond the aesthetics that are now in every video editor as an effect, what do these glitches, or what does this aesthetic then say about the about AI actually? Because I think if we think about these RGB glitch effects of the 2010s, I don't know what's left of that now in our in our consciousness. And I didn't have an answer for that, but maybe you have one.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that I would be ashamed of being accused of making glitch art. I think it's fine. But I do think it's important to differentiate glitch as an aesthetic and glitch as a rupture, and those are not my words. But this idea that when glitch is just a thing that is copied, then it's just an aesthetic, and it doesn't really stand for anything. It doesn't show us anything. With AI models, we're talking about a new kind of image generation thing that is so enveloped in myth that the glitch reveals that those myths are factually inaccurate, right? That there is something else mechanically overdetermined about the process through which we generate these images. And I think for many people, and people who come to sort of conferences about AI, right, this is not revelatory that the model is not making thoughtful decisions about which pixel is going to go where. But for many people in the general public, it is a kind of revelatory statement. And so by showing that, I think we're revealing the hidden mechanical sort of process, or algorithmic process, I suppose, if you will, of how these things work. I do think it's really important when we're talking about the aesthetics and the glitch to also really emphasize that these are not the model's idea of what a glitch looks like. The same way that it's not like a cat that we see is a model's idea of what the cat looks like. If we ask for a cat, right? If I type in glitch art into Stable Diffusion, I get something very different, right? I get like matrixy nonsense, 2010s like JPEG bending. But what we're actually seeing here is a failure. We're seeing an artifact of a failure in the system because of its inability to resolve the two things that it's being sort of requested to do. So it's a circumvention of the logic that results in a failure. And so to me, the artifact of that failure is interesting. I think the other thing that's important is that with glitch art, so much of it sometimes is like, look, I glitched this thing. And what I'm trying to do is use it as an artifact. I use it as a material, use these failures as material, as opposed to presenting them in and of themselves, which is why, for the most part, you see me working with them in different ways. There's always at least 2 or 3 additional sort of conceptual layers being involved there. So hopefully that means that in 2045, people don't look at my stuff and say like, you know, yeah, that's like, I don't know, I'm not gonna attack any glitch artists, but I hope that the storytelling and the sort of emotional resonance of the work survives beyond the kind of thing. And doing that exhibition, I've seen it, right? Like you could look at an Amjun Paik piece and say like television, like whatever. We don't do that anymore, right? But it's about the gesture, and I think it's really important to recognize that relationship with technology as being able to stand outside of the frame in such a way and restructure what the frame even is. That I think is really important for work in the arts.
Thanks. I will quote that.
Any more questions? Yep. Tobias.
Forgive me, Eryk, 'cause I'm sort of forming this question in my head as I go. And I guess what I would like to hear from you about is, so you've talked about how the affordances of image generation systems create certain images, and I'm wondering what affordances have created those image generation systems. Because there was at some point I remembered that thing that Vox discovered about why everyone has subtitles when they're streaming TV is because all the sounds been compressed for streaming on phones, because that's how people are watching stuff now. So the affordances of phones mean we've now got, sound engineering software that prioritizes that. So I'm interested in what would you think are the affordances of the way people use these systems or expect these systems that has then shaped those algorithms to the previous question that then is affording these types of glitches and noises to emerge? I appreciate it's not a very clear question.
No, I mean, the glitches that are emerging are, I'm working with a prompt window. I'm working within the affordances that I'm being given. Can I answer the question that I thought you were going to ask?
Go for it.
There is an affordance of these systems that I think is really interesting, which comes back to this concept of AI slop in terms of what these systems afford to us. And so there is something about I think a new kind of dynamic to these images and the capacities through which they are generated, wherein they are trained on data that has already been optimized by social media algorithms, right? Because they're scraping, if you look at the training data set, one of them is Leon 5B aesthetic, which is the training data that is the things that are most highly ranked on all the social media sites, all of the Reddit posts, et cetera. And so these things are essentially just super optimized already on images that will be swallowed and just blissful sort of whatever the algorithmic equivalent of a serotonin blast is. You get these images into Facebook and then they're automatically pumped out. They're automatically amplified. And so this thing that has happened as a result is this ecosystem where our work sort of rating and evaluating the images through algorithmic interfaces then creates an image that is optimized for those interfaces that we don't want to see at all. And so the affordances that I am sort of seeing with the sort of AI, and maybe we're using affordances differently, but there is this way of using that technology that is just creating a kind of weapon of mass destruction equivalent in the visual sphere for social media. And I think that's really interesting and terrifying. And there's so much to unpack about that space that I think is potentially interesting. But yeah, I totally just ignored your question. I was like,
that's completely fine.
All right.
You got the stage. You got it.
Okay.
Maybe a question about your work process. Basically, how does the project starts for you? Is it from working straight to working with a material, being AI models, or do you have some like process of framing first the questions which you want to tackle with models?
Yeah, it depends on the piece. A lot of times I'm really engaged in the metaphors. And so I'm trying to look at, in my policy work, I'm blessed to be this weird, maybe not blessed, but I have these two sides, right? I'm investigating the sort of discourse around AI and the questions and the sort of assumptions that are happening in that space. I'm trying to think about what are people assuming about these things? What are people believing about these things? What's being told to us about them? And how might we sort of imagine a different set of metaphors or disrupt the existing set of metaphors? And so usually it starts with that. I usually engage in a writing process, writing about those discourses. And then as I'm writing, there's usually a moment where I'm thinking about a question where it just feels intuitively, and I think it's okay to just say sometimes it's intuitively that I should check something out on the model. So, writing about reading about how the Gaussian noise works in an AI image model and just being like, well, what happens if we ask it for Gaussian noise then? And then seeing exactly what happens. And there's all these kinds of things like the puppet, we're thinking about puppets. We're constantly have this long history of writing about automata and robots and AI. And so this question of like, well, what happens if we ask, Midjourney to generate images of puppets? What do we see when we do that? And then noticing what we see, like the presence of the strings. And that leads us to another sort of conversation. So it's really about starting with these assumptions about the conversations that we're seeing through industry, through policy, and then trying to think, well, where are the friction points in that discourse? And then trying to get back to how do we visualize that? How do we imagine that differently? And for me, there's an additional level, which is to say, how do I make this not just about AI? Because I want the work to be something more than kind of technology communication or just literacy. It's more to me is I want to work with these as materials. I want to bring in the social context of AI and the questions and fears about being human that are entwined with it, and use that as a way of telling a story or making an image. So that's kind of a multi-layered process, but it's very iterative and it's constantly sort of being reevaluated, and working with other people also helps, and just talking to lots of other people also helps.
Last question, I guess.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really like this framing of noise as freedom of possibility. And I was wondering, because you already mentioned AI slop, so this is a little bit diverging maybe from what you've talked about, but maybe you have an idea about this. How do you feel with this whole AI slop? And I mean, at times where journalism is under threat, about the role of images as like archives, cultural memories, cultural artifacts. Where do you see this going? Do you have an opinion on that?
I am a bit concerned about what archives come to be and how archives are shaping image generation. One of the things involved in sort of the cultural research I do is for example, there's a certain type of image. It's called a stereo view image. It's like two images side by side, and they're sort of slightly off. So if you hold them a foot in front of you, they look kind of like they're floating. And you've asked Midjourney to generate these images. For some reason, what it generates is images of the American occupation of the Philippines at the turn of the century. And so we can look at that and we can say, well, why is that happening? And the reason it's happening is because the Library of Congress in the US has a massive exhibition of stereogram images that were specifically curated because they were trying to sell that story of the liberation of the Philippines by the United States. And what the model is doing is not telling you, there's a critical way of seeing this, right? There's a critical interpretation of what happened. These curators have written text about this, right? You're not getting any of that. What you're getting are pictures of young Filipino children standing in front of a very colonial-looking white school, and no one knows what to make of that, right? You'd have to go into the archival research. So the idea and the ways that these archives that we have, just by sheer size of the archive, they shape what comes out of these image models. And I am worried about the ways that transforms history, because now we have these images of children standing in front of schools in the Philippines that don't exist, and also reinforce a certain type of gaze, a certain type of relationship of power between the person holding the camera and the people posing. That can be easily erased, confused, eradicated, etc. So how do we protect against that? I don't know. It is very much on my mind. It's part of the subject of my research at Cambridge. But I think it's a very challenging thing. The other side of that is that we've never really had sort of pure documentary image either. So there is a way of sort of overstating the case of what's lost. But what we always had was context, even if that context was bad. We could go in and we could say, you don't have images labeled correctly in this archive. We need to change this. And there was a dialogue. But when it's lost in this vector space, there's no dialogue with the vector space, right? There's no changing the way the model, what evokes these images out of that space. So I think that there's something really important being lost there.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, because when we read and interpret images, we always do this in some kind of like cultural context or social context.
Exactly.
With the knowledge we, somehow acquired. And I feel as though this is something that is also getting lost on the way a little bit, that these images come without context and are being reproduced without being framed in a certain way, or
Yeah, I think that there's a tendency to try to control these models and to try to control the ways that they're used and what they're allowed to do. But I think that the other sort of, in the absence of seeing any real potential for regulation in the United States, for reasons I'm sure you can imagine, I'm really trying to emphasize this idea of surfacing the training data and the context of what's in that training data. And I think that there's a lot to unpack, and it's a great opportunity for artists and designers and people who are thinking about this organization of information to think about, well, what is this information? How is it organized in these training data sets? And how could we do it in ways that protect the parts of our culture that we think need protecting? Just to say, there's some very bleak images in these training data sets that if you were to be asked, should this be in a training data set for people to make pictures of fuzzy frogs? Like, we would absolutely say no. But anything online is fair game. And I think that's a really dangerous place to be.
thank you.
Thanks.
Super. Many thanks.
Thanks.